Shaq was just grabbing a bottle of water when a police siren wailed outside. A second later, Officer Daniels stormed in, eyes locked on an elderly nun. "Loitering again, huh?" he sneered. "Crack!" Without warning, he slapped her across the face. The store went silent. People gasped. Shoppers froze, clutching their phones, unsure whether to step in or start recording. But before Daniels could blink, a massive hand clamped down on his wrist. He turned and froze. It was Shaq. What happened next would end a career, expose corruption, and shake the entire city. Stay till the end. This story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq had seen a lot in his life, but this was something else. The moment Officer Brad Daniels' hand struck Sister Mary's cheek, a wave of stunned silence washed over the tiny corner store. The slap echoed through the aisles, making even the humming refrigerators sound deafeningly loud. The elderly nun stumbled back, one frail hand clutching her cheek, her wide eyes filled with shock but not fear. She had seen men like Daniels before, bullies who hid behind badges. But Shaq? He wasn't the type to stand by and let something like this happen. Before Daniels could blink, a massive hand clamped down on his wrist like a steel trap. He instinctively tried to yank his arm back, but it didn't budge. It was as if his bones had been fused in place by sheer force. His breath hitched as he finally looked up, and up, into the cold, unblinking eyes of Shaquille O'Neal. "You really think you can get away with that?" Shaq's deep voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that sent shivers down a man's spine because it meant the storm was just beginning. The cashier's fingers trembled as they hovered over the register buttons, unsure whether to call 911 or just watch history unfold. Customers clutched their phones, cameras rolling, their disbelief frozen on their faces. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was used to intimidating people, but now he was the one being towered over. Still, pride was a dangerous thing. His free hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching. "Step back, big guy," he snarled, trying to mask his unease. "Unless you want to be next." Shaq didn't move. If anything, his grip tightened just a little. Not enough to hurt, just enough to remind Daniels exactly how powerless he was in this moment. "You just put hands on a nun," Shaq said, shaking his head. "I suggest you think real hard before making another dumb decision." Sister Mary, still holding her cheek, took a slow breath. "Son," she said softly, addressing Daniels, "violence is never the answer. But if it were, I wouldn't bet on you." A few people in the store let out hushed chuckles, but Daniels wasn't laughing. His pulse pounded in his ears. The humiliation was setting in, and he wasn't about to let some oversized basketball player make a fool out of him. His fingers twitched again, this time more deliberately. Shaq saw it, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a forgiving one, the kind of smile that made a man reconsider all his life choices. Daniels exhaled sharply. His pride demanded action, but his instincts, they were screaming something else entirely. Then, against all better judgment, his hand started moving toward his holster. The moment his fingers touched the gun, Shaq knew this had just gotten serious. Daniels looked up, and for the first time in his career, he felt something new. Fear. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one he had never experienced in all his years of bullying civilians with his badge. But now, as his wrist remained locked in Shaq's vice-like grip, he felt a cold sweat beat at the back of his neck. The store was completely silent. Every customer, every cashier, even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to have stopped. The only sounds were the low murmur of recording phones and the rhythmic pounding of Daniel's own heartbeat. "You just put hands on a nun?" Shaq's voice was deep, steady, and laced with something dangerous. He wasn't yelling, wasn't flexing his size, but somehow that made it worse. There was no bluff, no threat in his tone, just a simple statement, and yet it carried a weight heavier than any badge Daniels had ever worn. His wrist throbbed under Shaq's grip, but Daniels forced himself to sneer, yanking his arm free with a sharp motion. He took half a step back, trying to regain control of the moment. His pride wouldn't let him look weak, not in front of all these people. "Step back, big guy," Daniels spat, rolling his wrist as if Shaq had actually heard him. His voice was laced with forced arrogance, but his eyes darted nervously toward the crowd of onlookers, all of them with phones aimed directly at him. "Unless you want to be next." Shaq didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying the officer as if deciding whether he was worth his time. The moment stretched unbearably long, the air thick with tension. Then Shaq let out a quiet chuckle. "You threatening me?" Daniel's pulse quickened. Something about the way Shaq asked the question made him feel like he was playing a game he didn't know the rules to. The pressure of all those eyes on him, the knowledge that he was being recorded, the shame burning in his gut after being humiliated. It all boiled together into something ugly. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to let it go, but his anger wouldn't let him. His fingers twitched. Then, without thinking, without considering the consequences, Daniel's hand shot down to his belt. His fingers curled around his holster, unclipping it with a sharp snap. "I said step back." The moment his hand touched his gun, Shaq knew this had just gotten serious. A tense, suffocating silence wrapped around the store like a noose. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the only sound other than the shallow, erratic breaths coming from Officer Daniels. His fingers trembled as they hovered over his holster, his rage battling with the weight of the dozen cameras now locked onto him. Sister Mary, still swaying slightly from the blow she had taken, let out a weak gasp. "Officer, please." Her voice was hoarse but firm, her eyes filled not with fear, but with sadness. The kind of sadness that came from knowing this wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Shaq exhaled slowly and raised his hands just a little. Not in surrender, but in warning. His massive frame barely shifted, but somehow he looked even larger, his presence alone commanding control over the entire room. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Shaq said, his deep voice rolling through the space like distant thunder. The weight of those words made Daniels flinch. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as the sweat glistening on his forehead caught the light. His eyes darted to the crowd, to the sea of smartphones capturing every move, every twitch, every breath he took. His hand hesitated. The customers weren't just watching anymore. They were live streaming. He could see it in their faces. Some of them were whispering, others frozen in place, their fingers gripping their phones so tightly their knuckles turned white. A teenage girl near the drink coolers whispered, "It's already got 1,000 viewers." Daniel's nostrils flared as his world started closing in on him. He was used to having the upper hand. He was used to people looking away, too afraid to step in. But now every single person in this store had become a witness. Shaq saw the hesitation flicker across Daniel's face like a glitch in a broken screen. He took a step closer, his voice lowering, his gaze narrowing. "You pull that gun, and we both know how this ends," Shaq said, his voice calm, unshaken. "Not just for me, not just for you, but for your whole damn career." Daniel's breath came out in a shaky exhale. Shaq's lips curled into a smirk. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were inviting him to make the mistake. "Go ahead. Try it," Shaq murmured, his eyes locked onto Daniel's like a predator eyeing its prey. "Let's see how that ends for you." The air felt razor sharp as Daniel's fingers twitched, one move away from crossing a line he could never come back from. A second police car screeched to a stop outside the corner store, red and blue lights flashing through the glass windows. Daniel's lips curled into a smirk. Backup was here. For the first time since Shaq had grabbed his wrist, he felt a surge of control return. He had called it in. His guys would take care of this. They always did. He straightened his posture, his fingers relaxing slightly near his holster as he prepared to twist the narrative in his favor. But then, the driver's side door opened and his confidence cracked. Sergeant Miguel Hernandez stepped out. Daniel's smirk vanished. Hernandez wasn't one of his boys. He wasn't the type to turn a blind eye or smooth things over. He was old school, strict, disciplined, and worst of all, honest. The moment Hernandez entered the store, his sharp eyes scanned the situation. Sister Mary's frail figure stood near the shelves, her face still red from the slap. The customers were frozen, some whispering, others still recording. Shaq remained still, his massive arms crossed over his chest, waiting. And then there was Daniels, his hand hovering over his holster, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Hernandez's expression darkened. "What the hell is going on here?" Daniels cleared his throat, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Sergeant, I had to step in. This woman was causing a disturbance. She was resisting arrest." A sharp inhale swept through the store. A few gasps. The tension coiled even tighter. Shaq let out a low, knowing chuckle. Slowly, he took a step back and gestured toward Daniels with a slight tilt of his head. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Go ahead, officer," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying an edge. "Tell him exactly what happened." Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Hernandez narrowed his eyes. "You lying to me, Brad?" Daniel's jaw tightened. His mind raced, searching for an escape. But with every camera pointed at him and Hernandez waiting, he realized too late. There was none. Daniels had no idea that his world was already crumbling around him. Outside the small corner store, the flashing red and blue lights from additional police cars reflected in the glass windows, casting a chaotic glow over the growing crowd. The sirens were loud, but not loud enough to drown out the murmurs of people watching with their phones held high, recording every second. The video was already spreading like wildfire, jumping from one screen to another, being shared, commented on, and dissected in real time. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Shaq remained unmoved, standing tall with his arms folded across his massive chest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned into Officer Daniels with an intensity that made the officer visibly uncomfortable. He had faced down aggressive players on the court, towering defenders trying to block his every move. But this was different. This wasn't a game. This was real life, and the stakes were higher than ever. Just a few feet away, Sister Mary stood near the counter, her hands still trembling as she held her bruised cheek. The elderly nun, a woman known for her kindness and selflessness, looked more shocked than hurt. She didn't lash out, didn't raise her voice. She simply observed in silence, a quiet storm of dignity and grace in the middle of the chaos. Then the front door swung open again, but this time, it wasn't more officers, it was the press. A woman in a sharp blue blazer entered the store with purpose, a microphone in hand, a cameraman closely following behind her. She barely paused to assess the scene before launching into action. "We're coming to you live from downtown," she announced, her voice crisp and professional as she spoke directly into the camera. "A shocking incident of police brutality has just unfolded right behind me. Officer Brad Daniels," she paused briefly as her eyes flicked to his name tag, "has allegedly assaulted a local nun, Sister Mary, a well-respected figure in the community. The entire event was caught on camera, and the footage is already making waves online." Daniel's face drained of color. His breathing turned shallow as he glanced around, his eyes darting from the reporter to the crowd, then to the cell phones held high, all capturing his every movement. Then a voice from the crowd cut through the moment. "It's all online, man, you're done." Daniel's head snapped toward the speaker, a young man holding up his phone. The screen was paused on an image frozen in time. Daniel's arm mid-swing, Sister Mary recoiling from the impact. Below the image, a bold news banner read, "Officer caught on camera, attacking nun. City demands justice." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, scrambling for a way out, an excuse, an explanation, anything that could undo what had just happened. Panic flared in his chest. He reached for his radio, his voice sharp and desperate. "Dispatch, I need immediate backup." But he never finished the sentence. Sergeant Hernandez moved faster. With a swift motion, he snatched the radio right off Daniel's belt, his own voice calm but firm as he spoke into it. "Chief, we got a situation." Daniels turned slowly, his entire body stiff. For the first time in his career, he felt something he had never truly felt before. It wasn't power. It wasn't control. It was fear. The weight of his actions was finally catching up to him, and as he stared at the cold, unblinking lens of the news camera in front of him, Daniels realized the truth. There was no escape this time. Somewhere across town, deep inside a mahogany-furnished office at the police headquarters, Chief Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair, sipping his late-night coffee. The station was quiet until his phone buzzed violently against the desk, disrupting the silence. He frowned, grabbing the phone. But the second he saw the flood of notifications, his hand froze midair. Breaking news. Officer assaults nun. Cameras catch everything. Live footage. Cop slaps elderly woman in front of NBA star Shaquille O'Neal. Briggs's face turned pale. He tapped on the link, and within seconds the video filled his screen. The moment played out in horrific clarity. Officer Brad Daniels storming into the convenience store, his aggression palpable. Sister Mary, a frail woman known for her charity work, standing there, confused yet composed. And then, the slap. Briggs' stomach twisted into a knot as he watched the scene unfold. He had seen bad incidents before, but this was catastrophic. The video was already past 1 million views in under an hour. A knock at his door startled him. "Sir, you need to see this," his assistant, Detective Alvarez, said as he stepped inside, phone in hand. I know," Briggs interrupted, his voice tight. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He didn't need a meeting, an internal report, or a press conference to tell him what had to be done. The entire world was watching. There was no spinning this, no burying it under bureaucratic paperwork, no protecting Daniels this time. Briggs picked up his office phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd have to call for something like this. "Hernandez," he said the moment the line clicked. "Chief," Sergeant Miguel Hernandez responded, his voice steady. "I was just about to call you." Briggs could hear the commotion in the background. Reporters shouting, police sirens blaring, people yelling. The chaos was already spilling beyond the walls of the convenience store. "You're with Daniels right now?" Briggs asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. He's trying to save himself, but—" "Cut him off," Briggs ordered. "Take his badge, now." There was a slight pause on the other end before Hernandez responded. "Understood." Briggs ended the call and leaned back in his chair, releasing a slow, measured breath. The department had its fair share of problems, but this was beyond salvageable. Daniels had become a liability, and there was only one way to deal with liabilities. Back at the convenience store, Daniels was still in full denial mode, his voice growing more frantic as he tried to justify himself. "She was resisting. She was being hostile. I was doing my damn job." But Hernandez was already stepping forward, his expression unreadable. "Brad Daniels," he said, voice firm. "You're suspended. Hand me your badge and gun." Daniels' mouth fell open, and for the first time he realized this wasn't just a bad night. His entire career was crumbling before his eyes. Daniels clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face was flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation, sweat beating at his temple as he stared down Sergeant Hernandez. The entire store had fallen into a tense silence, the weight of the moment pressing against every person in the room. The only sounds were the faint hum of the store's refrigerator and the distant murmurs of reporters gathering outside. "You're making a mistake," Daniels hissed through gritted teeth, his breath ragged. Hernandez didn't flinch. His stance was firm, authoritative, completely in control. "No, Brad," he said, voice even, measured. "You made a mistake the second you put your hands on an innocent woman." Daniels' eyes darted around the store. Customers and employees stood frozen, their phones still recording. His career, his entire reputation, was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then a low chuckle broke through the tension. Shaq, arms crossed over his broad chest, shook his head with an amused smirk. "You about to make another dumb decision?" His deep voice rumbled through the store like distant thunder. Daniel's nostrils flared as he turned his glare onto Shaq. "This isn't your business, O'Neill," he snapped. "You don't get to waltz in here and play hero." Shaq lifted an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Nah, man, you did this to yourself." He nodded toward the cameras, the flashing lights of news vans visible through the store windows. "Whole world's watching now." Hernandez took a step forward. "Brad," he said again, this time his tone more demanding. "Badge, now." Daniel's fingers twitched near his holster, as if some part of him still wanted to resist. But even he wasn't stupid enough to pull something with this many witnesses. His breathing grew heavier, his shoulders rising and falling with barely contained fury. For a long moment, he just stood there, locked in a silent battle between his pride and reality. Then with a sharp exhale, Daniels reached up, yanked his badge from his chest, and threw it onto the floor with a metallic clink. The room stayed silent, save for the sound of the badge spinning slightly before coming to a stop. "Now your gun," Hernandez said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Daniels hesitated. His hands hovered at his belt before he finally unholstered his weapon and placed it on the counter, his movements stiff and resentful. Outside, the murmurs grew louder, the crowd sensing the shift in power. Then as soon as Daniels stepped toward the door, a reporter shoved a mic in his face. "Officer Daniels, any comment on your suspension? Do you regret your actions?" Daniels' jaw tightened. His face, already red with embarrassment, darkened even more. For a second, it looked like he might say something, defend himself, spin the situation in his favor. Instead, he let out a frustrated growl and stormed off in silence. pushing past the swarm of cameras as the world watched his downfall in real time. The city had seen the fall of a corrupt cop. But what came next? That was the real question. The city had one response: enough. By the time the sun set that evening, the video of Daniel's downfall had spread like wildfire. News stations ran the footage on repeat. Social media exploded with outrage. And by morning, the streets outside the police station were packed with protesters. Handmade signs waved in the air. Justice for Sister Mary! End police corruption! No more Daniels! A chorus of voices chanted in unison, their demands echoing through the streets. It wasn't just about one cop anymore. This was about all the Daniels hiding behind a badge, using their power to intimidate instead of protect. From the steps of City Hall, reporters scrambled to interview anyone they could. Activists, local leaders, even former officers who had been forced out for speaking up. But the most shocking voices came from Daniel's own past. One by one, his previous victims stepped forward. A middle-aged black man in a crisp suit held a microphone, his hands trembling slightly. 4 years ago, I was pulled over by Officer Daniels for a broken taillight, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Next thing I knew, I was face down on the pavement with his knee in my back. I filed a complaint. Nothing happened. A Latina woman stepped up next. I was 19. He stopped me on my way home from work, accused me of being a gang member because I had tattoos. He pushed me against my car, searched me for no reason. My complaint? Ignored. Story after story poured in, each one a new nail in Daniel's coffin. Inside the police station, Chief Walter Briggs stood by his office window, arms crossed, watching the growing crowd with a deep frown. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. The department had spent years brushing things like this under the rug. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. The mayor had been watching too. That afternoon, Mayor Cynthia Holloway, known for playing it safe when it came to the police, called an emergency press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones were adjusted, and the city held its breath as she stepped up to the podium. She cleared her throat, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. Then, with a measured breath, she spoke. The people of this city deserve better. Effective immediately, we are launching a full-scale independent investigation into the police department. The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters cheered. And inside the police station, Chief Briggs closed his eyes, knowing the storm was just beginning. Daniels was gone, but the fight for justice had only just begun. What secrets would this investigation uncover? You want to know what real strength looks like? Shaq's deep voice carried across the press conference as he pointed at Sister Mary. The camera zoomed in on the frail, elderly nun standing beside him. Despite the bruise on her cheek, she held her head high, her eyes filled not with anger, but with resolve. The silence was heavy. Reporters, protesters, and even a few police officers in the back of the room hung on to Shaq's every word. Strength isn't about throwing your weight around. It's not about a gun or a badge or power. Strength is standing tall even after someone tries to knock you down, Shaq continued, his voice unwavering. He turned to Sister Mary. And I've never seen anyone stronger than this woman right here. Sister Mary stepped forward, clearing her throat softly. The bruising on her face was still fresh, but her voice was steady. I forgive Officer Daniels, she said, her words piercing through the tension in the room. A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but she wasn't finished. But forgiveness does not erase responsibility. Actions have consequences. He used his power to hurt, and now he must answer for it. Shaq nodded, then faced the cameras. His towering presence filled the room, but his expression was calm. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that protects people like him and silences people like her. He gestured to Sister Mary again. That stops today. Reporters shouted over each other, trying to get his attention. Shaq, do you think the department will actually change? What message do you have for the police force? Should Daniels face jail time? Shaq lifted a hand, and instantly the room fell silent. I've played in a lot of arenas, faced a lot of tough opponents, he said, his voice dropping into a low, deliberate tone. But the hardest battles? They ain't fought on basketball courts. They're fought in the streets, in courtrooms, in places like this. He turned back to the cameras, his eyes burning with intensity. You don't need a badge to be a man. You need respect. The world was listening. But would real change follow? No badge, no power, no future. Brad Daniels sat slumped in his dimly lit apartment, gripping a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The room was a mess. Papers strewn across the floor, half-eaten takeout containers stacked on the counter. The uniform he once wore with pride now hung over a chair, untouched since the moment he'd been stripped of his badge. On the television screen in front of him, a breaking news segment was playing. Former officer Brad Daniels under investigation for excessive force. More victims speak out. The headline made his stomach churn. A video clip played. The moment that ruined everything. Shaq's massive hand clamping onto Daniel's wrist. The look of pure disgust on the faces of every witness. Sister Mary's trembling but unshaken stance. The entire world had seen what he had done, and there was no spinning the truth now. Daniels gritted his teeth, grabbing the remote and turning the volume up. Community leaders are calling for criminal charges, the anchor reported, and sources confirmed that Daniels' previous cases are now under review. A number of individuals have already come forward, claiming they were harassed or assaulted by the former officer. The mayor's office has yet to comment. Daniels let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. This wasn't supposed to happen. For years he had walked through the city like he owned it. He never feared consequences. His word had been law. And now? Now he was just another disgraced ex-cop with nowhere to go. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You got what you deserved, pig." The messages had been coming all day. Threats, insults. Even old friends on the force had gone radio silent. Daniels grabbed his phone and dialed a number. His old captain, Walter Briggs. "Briggs, you gotta help me," he blurted the second the line connected. "They're destroying my life. You know I didn't do anything wrong." A sigh came through the receiver. "Brad, I can't help you." Daniel's chest tightened. "Come on, man, we've covered for worse before." "Not this time," Briggs cut him off. "It's over. You need to get a lawyer." A click, and the call was dead. Daniel sat motionless, his hands shaking as he dropped the phone onto the table. For the first time in his life, there was no one left to protect him. The news anchor's next words made his blood run cold. Sources say Daniels could be facing criminal charges. A new day, a new system. The fallout from the Daniels scandal didn't fade. It ignited a movement. The streets outside City Hall were packed, a sea of protesters holding signs demanding justice. Accountability now. No badges for abusers. The energy was electric, fueled by a community that refused to let this be just another forgotten case. Under immense pressure, the mayor held a press conference, his expression tense. Cameras flashed as he cleared his throat. Effective immediately, we are implementing a new police oversight commission, one that is fully independent and has the power to investigate misconduct without interference. The crowd erupted in cheers. Real change was happening. Across town, Shaq sat in a conference room with local leaders, community activists, and civil rights attorneys. He didn't just step in to stop Daniels. He was making sure this never happened again. "Too many people suffer in silence," Shaq said, leaning forward. "Let's make sure they got someone fighting for them." And with that, the O'Neill Justice Fund was born, a multi-million-dollar initiative dedicated to providing legal aid to victims of police brutality. Meanwhile, Sister Mary hadn't slowed down for a second. In a small church kitchen, she packed brown paper bags filled with food. Despite her bruised face, despite the chaos of the past week, she hummed softly as she worked. A line of people, many homeless, some just struggling, waited outside the church doors. A young woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Sister, after what happened to you, I thought you'd stop doing this." Sister Mary smiled warmly, pressing a meal into her hands. "My child, when has a little darkness ever stopped the light?" As Sister Mary turned, a young man approached her looking nervous. "Sister, you don't remember me, do you?" "Evil only wins if good men do nothing," Shaq said. "And I don't do nothing." The weight of those words hung in the air long after the chaos had settled. The city had changed. People had changed. And Shaq knew that while one battle was won, the fight for justice would never truly be over. Standing outside the church, he took a deep breath, the scent of fresh rain clinging to the pavement. Across the street, Sister Mary continued her work, handing out meals with the same unwavering kindness she had always shown. Despite everything, despite the bruise on her cheek that was still faintly visible, she smiled. "You sure you don't want to stick around?" she asked, tilting her head. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, sister. My work here's done." She patted his arm. "God bless you, Shaquille." As he walked toward his car, people from the neighborhood stopped to shake his hand, to thank him. to take selfies. He smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. This wasn't about fame. It never had been. It was about respect. Meanwhile, Daniels had become a ghost. His face was plastered all over the internet, but he wasn't walking the streets anymore. No badge, no gun, no power. A news report played in a dimly lit bar where he sat hunched over a drink. His name had become synonymous with corruption, with disgrace, with failure. Daniels, who was once a respected officer, is now under multiple investigations following the release of body cam footage showing other questionable arrests in his past. He gritted his teeth. His career was over. And deep down, he knew. He did this to himself. But the world moved on. The viral video of Shaq standing up for Sister Mary sparked a national conversation. It made people question their justice system, their leaders, and themselves. It inspired action. A week later, Shaq sat in a different city, sipping coffee as his phone buzzed with an update from Hernandez. Accountability hearings start next week. Wouldn't have happened without you. Shaq exhaled slowly, looking out at the skyline. This was just the beginning. The video that started it all, it didn't just change one city, it changed everything.